Around 220,000 Ohioans are unemployed, according to data from the Ohio Department of Job and Family Services, which deals with unemployment claims and payments, as well as cash and food assistance, child support, and adoption, among other things. ODJFS is the fifth largest state agency by number of employees, but it has a huge reach, especially with people in need. Quite often, people outside the system think about fraud, scams, cheating, and dead people getting unemployment checks, particularly during the pandemic. ODJFS did dole out nearly $2 billion in fraudulent overpayments, but also made more than $5.7 billion in non-fraudulent overpayments. The pandemic exposed some serious problems in the system because of years of underinvestment, which are being addressed. But those trying to navigate through the unemployment claims system now still complain of long wait times and confusing bureaucracy. I sat down with the ODJFS director to talk about that and more. We can start with some good news. The state's unemployment rate is about 3.7%, unchanged from January. The state did set a record jobless rate low for 2023, below the national rate there. But it wasn't until halfway through last year that the state actually surpassed its record 5.6 million jobs that was set back in May 2000. Why did it take so long for Ohio to regain that 5.6 million level jobs?
Well, we certainly knew that because of the pandemic, it would take a while for all of those things to recover. Ohio has done a tremendous job under Governor DeWine's leadership in making Ohio a great place to do business, raise a family. We knew it would take time, but it's happening. As you mentioned, Ohio's rate is better than the national rate. As we come out of this kind of seasonal time right now of the winter, we would expect over the next couple of months for that rate to continue to improve and more people to come back to work.
For people who are filing for unemployment benefits, on the other side of that, you've instituted a new way of proving identification by allowing people to go to post offices and prove that. Is that to try to cut down on the calls and the wait times? Are you still having trouble with calls and wait times that really people were complaining about during the pandemic? Also, the website not being available. Is that to try to deal with some of those issues?
So at JFS, one of our three guiding principles is that we get better at what we do every day. And so one of the things that we recognized is that the things that we put in place to mitigate fraud also created challenges for non-fraudulent individuals, and so we're always kind of balancing that accuracy and security pieces. So one of the things that we implemented with the assistance of the United States Post Office and the U.S. Department of Labor, we're I think the 7th state to do this now, is that for individuals who go through the process and that we know have to provide some form of identification documentation, instead of submitting that online or going through some of our other processes, they can take it in person to one of the almost 700 post office locations in the state of Ohio. And so that's helping us both from a customer service standpoint, and it's also an additional fraud mitigation measure, because if an individual is filing a fraudulent claim, they're not likely to take physical documents into a person at the post office to try to prove their identity.
I know people during the pandemic were concerned about the whole system and kind of it fed into this argument that has been made before, that the unemployment benefit system is not set up to really make it easy, that it's hard for people to file their claims, and it's intentionally that way. What do you say when people bring up that argument?
Yeah, well, we certainly don't design it to be intentionally difficult, certainly because it is something that an individual has to demonstrate eligibility for based on the time that they've worked and their earnings that they've accumulated. We have to have a process that we make sure that the eligibility is there. And so there have to be some kind of, some things in place. But at the same time, we want to make sure that we're improving our customer experience for Ohioans, whose employers have paid into the system, who have earned eligibility, and who find themselves unemployed. And so, certainly we've made some improvements during the pandemic. We have an RFP getting ready to go on the street this summer to replace the system that will hopefully overhaul the entire customer experience for claimants and taxpayers alike, as well as make it scalable for instances in the future, a recession or a pandemic, where more people need to use the system than kind of happens normally.
An overhaul, that's got to be expensive to overhaul the entire system that goes back decades.
It does. It's running on a mainframe system. It's an outdated programming language, and so it'll be a heavy lift for us to replace that that system, but we spent a lot of time learning a lot of important lessons from the pandemic, making sure those are documented into the requirements. So it'll be a heavy lift both from a technology standpoint, a training standpoint for us, and certainly fiscally.
Tens of millions of dollars for that probably, or even hundreds?
I would not expect it to be in the hundreds, certainly in the short run. Part of why we do the competitive RFP is to get the price as low as possible, but we also want to make sure that we're not buying just the cheapest product. We want to make sure that we have value and that the system is doing the things that we needed to do and that Ohioans needed to do.
Another new thing here is a provision in a law that took effect last year that requires people who are getting unemployment benefits to bank with Ohio institutions. And I believe there's a debit card for people who are not banking with Ohio institutions, financial institutions. Why that?
Yeah, one of the things that we saw during the pandemic, and certainly the legislature, as they created the House Bill 614 Council that kind of monitored our activities during the pandemic, one of the things that we saw were a lot of fraudulent activity with out-of-state banks, especially online banking systems that don't always have all the same requirements as brick and mortar banks. And so the legislature proposed, and we supported the idea of having Ohioans, when they're making that direct deposit, be limited to using a bank with a physical presence in the state. If a person doesn't have a bank that is bricks and mortar here in Ohio, there's still two other ways that they can get their unemployment benefits. One is we can mail them a check, or we can mail them a debit card that has the weekly amount added each week.
So does that affect like online banks, banks that are only online?
It would primarily affect online banks that are exclusively online. If a bricks and mortar bank has an online presence, certainly that's okay. But we want to make sure that there's a bank that we can go and knock on the door if we need to talk to somebody about fraudulent activity.
Speaking of that, you identified about $6.9 billion in fraudulent and non-fraud overpayments in the traditional unemployment program and also the pandemic unemployment assistance or PUA program. The fraudulent payments got a lot of attention because obviously scammers involved in that. Those fraudulent payments totaled $1.19 billion of that $6.9 billion total. The non-fraudulent payments, so I guess the accidental overpayments, were $5.7 billion. So how did that happen that the non-fraudulent payments were so much more than the fraudulent ones?
Well, when you think about the non-fraudulent payments, there's kind of two categories. One are individuals who, are legitimate individuals here in Ohio who got paid an amount that they should not have been paid. And then there are a lot of non-fraudulent payments that are likely fraud, but it's an adjudication process that we have to actually have a finding of fraud in order to call it fraud. And so there's some portion of those non-fraudulent payments that are fraud, but we just don't have enough evidence to call them fraud. For individuals who received an overpayment that they were not eligible for, part of that was because of the nature of the pandemic programs that were being kind of created by the federal government as we went along. As they would create new rules, certain circumstances would be, we paid a person that we thought were eligible under the old rules, now they're not eligible. That creates a non-fraud overpayment. The federal government did allow a process for some of those to be waived, and so we've been working through those with individuals who are eligible for the waivers.
When you talk about non-fraud payments being recovered, does that mean individuals who have been overpaid have to pay that money back? And if so, how does that affect those people who are seeking help for not having income coming in?
Yeah. So certainly in cases where there was a payment made, an overpayment that was not fraudulent, if the individual can document that they did everything that we asked them to, and that the overpayment is a result of changing of the rules and those kinds of things, we can waive that. Other instances where, people didn't give us all the information or maybe withheld information, and that comes down after the fact, we're going to make those kinds of recoveries, and we work with, with the Attorney General when the collections are needed to be made, and certainly, work with the individuals to, create payment plans where we can. As
of December, you report that you've recovered $139.4 million of fraud and non-fraud payouts to traditional unemployment, $191.4 million of fraud and non-fraud payments to the PUA program. That's a total of $330.8 million recovered out of $6.9 billion. That's not much when you look at it in that way.
Yeah, when we had, I think, our second press conference after I joined the agency, one of the things that we talked about with some of our law enforcement partners, because of the nature of the fraudulent activity that was happening in Ohio and all the other states, a lot of it was international crime rings, those kinds of things. As soon as those dollars hit bank accounts, they were moved immediately. And so for a lot of that, both in Ohio and nationally, there's never going to be recovery. For a lot of those dollars that you did mention, we worked very closely with financial institutions, many who, because of the nature of their regulations from the federal government and the banking system, were able to see kind of on the other side of the horizon that we couldn't see, and banks stopped payments from being made because of activity that they saw on their side. So a lot of that is money that we've recovered from individuals, but also that banks, in cooperating with us, were able to return because they didn't send it on down the line.
One of the things the legislature has been talking about for more than a decade now, I believe, is the Unemployment Compensation Fund. What's happening with that and shoring that up? Can you talk about that?
Yeah, well, after, during the pandemic, Ohio, like I think every other state, had to borrow from the federal government to shore up its fund. The federal government allowed the states to use a portion of their one-time federal COVID dollars to pay those back and to restore the fund to where it was pre-pandemic. So Governor DeWine did that here in Ohio, and because we've had a growing economy and a growing labor market, we've been able to continue to pay into that fund in Ohio. The legislature has had several different proposals over the last couple of years. One of the things that's always important in those conversations is you want to balance, where those changes lie. Is it all on the side of the claimants in terms of reducing the weeks of eligibility, or is it all on the ratepayers by increasing the taxes on employers? So, the legislature is always having those conversations to figure out how best to balance those, and we're always involved in those conversations, running impact for the fund for different changes that they may make.
One of the other things that you folks do at ODJFS is administer the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP, or food stamps. Yeah. You have warned recipients that there are scammers using skimmers out there. What's happening with that, and what's the concern?
Yeah, so the SNAP benefits are put on what we call an EBT card. It's basically what any of us have in our pocketbook or our wallet, a credit card type thing that they can use at the same kind of devices, point of sale devices at grocery stores as others would use a credit card or a debit card. So the same kind of, just like the pandemic, the same kind of fraudulent activity that we see bad guys trying to do in the private sector against banks and credit cards, we're seeing on the SNAP side, again, not just in Ohio, but nationwide. And so what we encourage our SNAP card holders to do is to make sure that they have their card pinned, have a personal identification number on that card that they turn on and off depending on when they are making transactions, and to change that PIN regularly. We have an app that they can use if they have a smartphone or a laptop device at home that they can manage their account. The federal government also, as a result of the pandemic and seeing an uptick of SNAP fraud nationally, for the first time created a process by which states can reimburse individuals who have had SNAP benefits stolen. So we started that process, but really, security and vigilance is the front of that process, and so really encourage card holders to pin their cards and monitor their transactions.
There have been some moves to try to put photo IDs on, or photos on, these cards. The concern was, of course, preventing fraud, though the fraud that's been reported in that program is not very significant, and also there are concerns about what if a caregiver is using the food stamp recipient's card, and that would create problems. Where do you stand on photo ID or photos on these cards?
Well, the type of, it's important to remember that with SNAP and with that EBT card, SNAP benefits are for a household, individuals who purchase and prepare food together. And so anyone in that authorized household can use that card. So, having an individual's photo on that card really isn't going to cut down on the fraud that we do see that's really impacting people, which are those skimming type of scams of individuals. And so we have some other ideas that we will be working with the legislature, certainly in a future budget, to fund. One of the challenges is this is a federal program, but then the states, if they want to add extra safeguards to protect their citizens, federal benefits, have to pay for those with GRF. And so there's some things that we could do, going to chipped cards and those kinds of things that will help further protect. But whether it's unemployment, whether it's SNAP, whether it's my credit card or your bank statement, the bad guys are always trying to take advantage. And so we have to spend money to try to stay one step ahead of them.
And finally, there was an expansion of state government in the budget in the addition of the new Department of Children and Youth. And you'll be working with that department and its director, Kara Wente. Tell me a little bit about what that department's going to do that doesn't duplicate what you already are doing with children and youth.
Yeah, so, expanding state government in the sense of adding another cabinet office, but really it was just a lift and shift of individual state employees and programs from 6 existing state agencies into a new one. Most of those individuals came from JFS, where we had publicly funded childcare licensing, and the children's services system for the state. And so all of those programs are now migrating over to Kara's team at the Department of Children and Youth. And I think really the goal of Governor DeWine when he set this up and proposed this in the budget is, making sure that we have an individual, a department who wakes up every day and that's all they think about are Ohio's kids. From a JFS standpoint, we think about unemployment and food stamps and all kinds of other things in addition, but really having this one agency will pull all of those functions from 6 agencies. The example that we used a lot during the budget was, if an individual is starting a childcare program, they're potentially interacting with JFS around eligibility. They're potentially working with ODH around food standards and those kinds of things, working with ODE if they are a Head Start program. And so pulling all those things under one roof, the goal is to create some efficiencies that are customer facing and really make sure that very critical time period of 0 to school age has a department that is 100% focused on the well-being of that future generation of Ohioans.
Some of the work that ODJFS was doing with kids, such as publicly funded childcare, has been moved into a new cabinet-level office, the Department of Children and Youth. Dan Schroeder says that wasn't an expansion of state government as much as a shift of employees and programs from 6 existing state agencies into one.